As always, this will be on all your favorite platforms under Lead Lag Live. Please, folks, do me a favor. Check out that podcast on Spotify and Apple. My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Per Bylund, Associate Professor, Entrepreneurship. A lot of interesting things we'll be talking about. It has a great book as well. Per, introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved in academia? And why write the book?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. Well, I mean, very briefly, I'm an associate professor of entrepreneurship, as you said, in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. I am a trained economist, however, so my PhD is in applied economics. But in my previous life, I suppose you could say, I was a systems developer and I was involved in politics as well. So I started out actually my studies in informatics, that is systems development pretty much, and political science. So those were my first degrees. And then after working for 7 or 8 years or something like that as a systems developer, I decided to transition into academia. So I went back to grad school in order to get a PhD, and I got the PhD. You mentioned the Mises Institute, and I actually got in touch with my advisor, Peter Klein, through the Mises Institute. So I left Sweden, where I grew up, and spent my first 3 decades for Missouri in order to work on my PhD. And then from there, I got a position at Baylor and then moved a little north to Oklahoma State.
I actually had Peter on a Twitter space not too long ago. Funny how that works. Okay, so I went to NYU and I took a class on entrepreneurship. And I look back at that, and while I think it was interesting to do as a undergrad, I tend to be a little bit skeptical of the idea that you can teach entrepreneurialism, because I think there's a lot of personality aspects to being an entrepreneur, to being a risk taker, to being with. Talk about just from your perspective as somebody who teaches on the subject, what makes for somebody being a successful entrepreneur, and can anybody be an entrepreneur? Is it something that can be learned?
Well, yeah, those are sort of hot topics for sure. And those are questions with several different answers as well. I mean, it really depends on what you mean. And I'm going to use sort of the academics cop-out answer here. Let's say that it depends on the definition, right? And can you teach entrepreneurialism, the way you put it, that is being entrepreneurial, whatever that means? Not necessarily. I mean, that probably is a sentiment where you're going for opportunity. You might not be disturbed by the risks involved or the costs, and you have your eyes on the prize and things like that. You can learn it for sure, but can you teach it? That's not necessarily true. On the other hand, I mean, can you help people become more successful when starting a business and attempting to sort of carve out a niche or a space in the marketplace? Then, yeah, of course you can. And I think, entrepreneurship is really, really hard. Most entrepreneurs fail most of the time. Unfortunately, I think that the reason that a lot of entrepreneurs fail is because they make the same mistakes as people have made before them too. And what we can do through teaching entrepreneurship is to teach sort of best practices and teach what to think about and what maybe not to think about. And I think we can do that pretty well. Many students of entrepreneurship are probably forced to go through courses where they put together business plans. And I mean, it's like people say, who is going to read your business plan? Well, maybe a banker and then your professor, but nobody else probably. And that might be true, but the point is not to produce an actual business plan. The point is to have a sort of systematic, structured approach to your business. So you go through all those pieces that are necessary to lay that big puzzle that's going to be your business, and thinking about the right things, not falling for such things as if you build it, they will come, which is common among entrepreneurs, that they sort of fall in love with their idea and they want to keep their idea so secret so that no one else can take it because their idea is fantastic. And then they work in secret and behind closed doors, and they finish the product, and then they open everything and it's released, and they basically go, okay, world, here I am. This is the success you've been waiting for. And then nobody cares. That's usually the result, right? And there are plenty of errors that you've committed here. One is thinking that people value something just because you value it, which might not be true. You haven't even considered who you're talking to, and you haven't realized that what you're producing is not to be valued by you, it's to be valued by the person you're trying to sell it to. And how much they value it, it's not really up to you as an entrepreneur. You are at the mercy of their valuation. So placing the customer front and center in your undertaking is super important. And unfortunately, a lot of people starting businesses, they don't think about this. They learn it the hard way. And sometimes it's fairly cheap, but very often it's very costly to learn it the hard way because you lose all your savings and all your investment and maybe your house and everything. So avoiding such things, we can definitely teach those. And I think in part it's the practice of how to do it, and in part is simply sound thinking about how the economy works, which is not the same thing as the graphs that you learn in the Econ 101 or the math that you go through in intermediate economics courses. But there's a different way of thinking about and understanding the economy that you sort of have to acquire in order to be a successful entrepreneur, I think.
Yeah, no, actually, I'm glad you say that because I'm always of the mindset that the macro makes it more likely for an entrepreneur to thrive. The micro allows them to survive when the macro is not giving them the tailwind. And the business plan point, I think, is actually really interesting for the audience to keep in mind. I'm very much a proponent of the idea that if you're going to start a business, you better put a business plan together for you, not for your investors. Because to your point, it forces you to think about the execution, the assumptions. And you and I both know ideas are cheap. Execution is what differentiates, the winners from the losers.
Right, and that's also a common mistake, right? That people tend to think of entrepreneurship in terms of the idea, but the idea doesn't matter. You can be a very successful entrepreneur with a crappy idea if your execution is awesome and you do it in a new way. And you can have a fantastic idea and nothing comes out of it at all. And then we would really call that an invention, right? There's a classical distinction between invention and innovation that I think is very important to understand. The invention is the new idea, the new thing, if you will, like a new material or a new way of doing something. The novel thinking is there. Innovation is really taking an idea, not necessarily a new one, to the market and making it valuable. And it can be producing something that has been produced before, but doing it in a little slightly different way, or talking to a different audience, or providing it in a new way. And I mean, one good example of that sort of thing is Volvo producing automobiles. It's nothing new. They've been doing this since, I don't know, the 50s or something like that. So it's nothing new, and everybody knows what a car is. Everybody knows what a Volvo is. So what's new? Well, what's new is that they have reconceptualized how they sell cars. So they're moving into instead renting out cars and leasing them out. Of course, leasing has been part of the automobile industry for a very long time. But Volvo thinks of the car not as their customers buying it from them, and then if they want to, they can buy service and whatever else. Instead, Volvo maintains ownership in a sense, so you just subscribe to the service of having a car, which is very different because now Volvo would then be responsible for service and maintenance and things like that, and also fixing it if something goes wrong. And of course, you can see how this is valuable to a customer who doesn't have to care about those things anymore. And with self-driving cars, you can extend this new way of selling cars to simply saying, well, you have subscribed to a certain type of, say, Volvo SUV or whatever. So you have one at home and it's parked outside and whatever. And when you travel somewhere, well, then that type of car will come and pick you up at the airport and take you somewhere because it's a self-driving car. And then the car that you had at home is supplying someone else with sort of personal transportation. It's still a car. It's still a manufactured automobile, just like before, but they've reconceptualized how to provide the service, right? That's innovation, but not invention, because there's really nothing new in it, right?
And that's a direction I wanted to go. I mean, is it fair to say that, to your point, because everything's so saturated now, that in general, entrepreneurs focus more on the innovation, a different way of delivering something, a different way of framing something, as opposed to legitimate inventions? I mean, the patent offices are full of all kinds of things and processes that never came to market, probably because even if they did, there's a competitor that's close enough that wouldn't violate any laws.
Well, I mean, I think entrepreneurs should focus on innovation rather than invention. It doesn't mean that they should necessarily exclude inventions. I'm not sure they do it to the same extent, though. I mean, there's no innovation in starting a new dry cleaner in some town, right? Because there are already a dozen, say, and you're the 13th one. That's not very innovative. Maybe you can carve out a little piece of that market. Maybe you're a little closer to where some people live, so they're going to go to you or whatever. But you're not really creating new value in the market much. And much of the inventions, many inventions fail completely. And you have many of the big tech companies, they have big departments of engineers and others just trying to figure out new stuff. Microsoft has their, I think they call it Basic Research Center or something like that, where they have hundreds, possibly thousands of people involved in doing basically what people claim only academia can do. So, and universities do this too. Universities tend to produce a lot of novelty and new materials, new methods, new discoveries, this type of basic research, but are terrible at doing something with those discoveries. So they're actually not actually creating any value. Instead, when they make these discoveries available to others, private businesses can often figure out how to use them, but not always, right? So I think entrepreneurs definitely need to be more innovative and need to think about how they create value, which probably takes us in the direction of the customer. Who the heck is the customer, and how can you serve the customer? And I think entrepreneurs need to realize that they are really in the business of creating everybody's tomorrow. That's how I usually phrase it. That if you think of it that way, that whatever it is you're doing when you're starting a business, when you're trying to carve out a niche, even if you're just focusing on becoming a professional within a business, you still need to figure out how you contribute value to the world. And a particular part of the world that you can serve well, that's where you create a lot of value. And that's why you would also be remunerated for it. That's why you would earn a salary or a profit, because you can provide them with a lot of value. And it's in that exchange or that interaction that entrepreneurship thrives, and that entrepreneurship can be really successful.
Speaking about the idea of everybody's tomorrow, I wonder if you've given thought to how artificial intelligence might alter the dynamics for entrepreneurs going forward. Now you've got competition from algos that can come up with entire business plans or come up with entire contracts, and who knows how it's going to look several years from now, obviously. But any thought on how AI might make being an entrepreneur easier or harder?
Yeah, sure. The way I think about it is that AI is really just another step in terms of developing technology. And technology for an economist is really capitals, is capital goods. And they have really one function in production, and it is to improve labor productivity. So what that means, of course, is that it will replace some people and some jobs. This technology can do much more effectively, which really means liberating mankind from those jobs so that we can focus on something else. So I think it will definitely disrupt parts of how we're doing things, but I don't think we're even close to an actual intelligence. So the large language models that we have now, that's all the rage, it's really sifting through the internet and predicting what to say in a chat engine. And when you ask it questions, you can get all kinds of bullshit as an answer. I asked ChatGPT when it was released to summarize my book, and it produced a pretty nice review. It was just a big chunk of it was completely wrong. It was just made up. And I tried to use Bing's implementation of ChatGPT 4 in my research. And I knew that Ronald Coase, a Nobel laureate, he has written a certain thing somewhere, but I just couldn't find it. So I asked Bing Chat to find that quote for me and also supply the source, which Bing does really well. And it found a quote, and I was like, whoa, this is at least as good as I remembered it. And had a source and everything like that. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, since I was supposed to quote it, I needed the actual citation. So I clicked on the link, and it took me to a page that didn't really address that issue and didn't at all supply that quote. And then I did a regular web search for the quote and came up with nothing at all. So it turns out that it had produced a quote for me following my instructions, but it wasn't actually a quote, and it provided a reference, but the reference wasn't actually to a source of the quote because it just made it up. And I can see how that can happen using the algorithm and so forth, right? But it's not an intelligence, because an intelligence would say, well, I couldn't find it, sorry, or I don't think what you're looking for is actually existing, so you try something else instead, or whatever the answer might be, right? But not make something up, because that's just deceptive, especially if you're using it to research. Imagine if I had not looked into the source and had used that quote in one of my articles, and it might have and probably would have glided through peer review as well and be published, and that would be. Well, it would be a huge embarrassment.
But it's only embarrassment if people notice. So I think this is sort of the bigger issue.
All true.
Right. This is the bigger issue from my perspective, which is that we're entering a period in society where the ease with which somebody can get an answer, the right side of the equal sign, is so unbelievable that nobody's going to even think or question, the content of one's work, the intellectual capital that goes into it, because everyone assumes it's automatically right because we're used to getting right answers.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's scary, because we have so much information at our fingertips, and if we get answers that are wrong, I mean, I know when I comment on things on Twitter, a little now and then I use scare quotes to just make up what could be a quote, and then I comment on it, just to sort of make clear how silly a certain often held belief about the economy is. And people tend to take those at face value, thinking that, well, first of all, that I said it, even though it has quotation marks, which is missing part of what I actually wrote. And then asking, who are you quoting here? Well, I made it up, right? That I think that could be a huge problem if we take things for granted. And I mean, the obvious solution to it is to think critically and teach people to think critically. So I think the timing of this couldn't really be worse, because if school has failed in anything, it is to produce critical thinkers. And now we get all these answers where we really need to be critical and really assess the truth value, if any, in these answers that we get, like within a second or two. And we don't really have the means to do that. I think this might actually lead to people thinking more critically. So using ChatGPT, for instance, to produce your term papers in school, or if you have a home exam or whatever, and using the web to answer the questions rather than thinking it through yourself. As long as you have someone that actually catches you in the act, or at least figures out that you did it wrong, then that might be a way of wakening up to the fact that you can't just blindly regurgitate whatever it is that you're finding, which of course always was the true. You can't just regurgitate what your professor tells you either. Hopefully that is a little better than a chat engine just making stuff up.
But I am curious about that, just given Oklahoma State, just in general, to your point about the educational institutions. What sort of what kind of internal discussions are happening around other professors and faculty around AI and this idea that anybody can just put a paper together, just literally typing a couple of questions and have it automatically spit out to them? I mean, it may be recognizable now because the technology is not perfect, but maybe in a couple of years it's going to be indistinguishable, right? So how do you even deal with that or think through that? How can you even grade exams or anything or papers if you don't even know if it's written by the person or not?
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and I think some of my colleagues have as well. Most, I don't think, are really up to date on this technology. But I mean, I've already captured or caught a few students using all kinds of engines and so forth to produce their term papers and respond to questions that they were supposed to answer themselves and things like that, right? And pretending that it's theirs. Of course, that's that's fraud, right? Because you're saying whether you actually state it explicitly or not. When you turn it in the term paper and it's not you who wrote it, that's cheating and it's fraud because you claim that you produced it. So far, I wish it were the case that these engines were so bad that you could immediately recognize that a student did not produce it, but they're not. Instead, I would say the way to recognize it is that it includes less errors than a typical student paper, and not in terms of content, but in terms of presentation. So it's usually slightly better written, and it has definitely fewer grammatical and spelling errors. And of course, a professor, unless you have a very big class, usually you sort of know your students. You learn that in a week or two, where they're sort of maybe level. Maybe you can call it level. I don't really like that term, but you see what I mean. Some students, you know that, well, I can expect these students to produce a good term paper because they've always been sort of A students, and then this student is a C student. Not that means that you are going to give them a C, but they've so far performed on that level, so you would expect them to have more errors and so forth, right? So you can catch them in that sense. I have used, thanks to a colleague of mine, certain tools online where you can, that at least they claim that they can find out whether a text has been written by an AI, but they are not good at all. And it doesn't, I mean, it gives you an indication, I suppose, but it's not really reliable. So, I mean, what you have to do is probably, as a professor, what I will do is use these tools rather than try to fight them, right? Because it's obviously they are there. Students know how to use them, most of them. Professors usually don't. So the way to do this is to use them as part of the teaching instead. So when I teach courses where I expect students to write term papers and things like that, I will probably ask them to first produce a term paper using ChatGPT or whatever engine, and then submit that one, and then submit their revisions of it, because that's a whole lot of more work if they are to go through and produce a new one using an AI tool and then revise it and whatever else, and have this as a process and not a sort of one-off. And I think that solves other problems too, because very often students, they think they get away with sitting the night before deadline and crunching out a paper in 3 hours. Of course, it sucks as a paper in all kinds of respects. And of course, we can recognize it when reading them that this is not well thought out at all. And we can solve that problem too by simply letting the term paper be part of the process. You turn in several iterations throughout the semester. And I think that will help students become better writers too, but it's of course more work for a professor.
I have to tell you, I was laughing when you made that point that you can tell based on the grammar being worse than what comes out from ChatGPT. I mean, I think that's actually maybe telling about just the state of people's usage of language more than anything else. But one thing that you can argue AI cannot do very well is write a book. So let's transition to how to think about the economy, your book. So first of all, talk about why did you decide to put that book together? I mean, obviously it has some great reviews. I'm in the investment industry, and I will be the first one to say, even I don't understand how the economy works because it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, right. And I mean, the question is really, why did I decide to spend time writing an introductory book on the economy? Aren't there such already? And yeah, the answer is yes, there are plenty. But usually they have certain problems that are, pretty big problems actually for the reader. And I was looking for one that explained the economy as a process and what I would call sound economics, one that had entrepreneurship at the very core, which if you've taken economics courses in college, you know that entrepreneurship is not really even a topic. One that doesn't use a lot of math and stuff like that, but actually can be read. And there are some of those. So Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, and there are some others too that are pretty good. But I wanted one that was more into Austrian economics. You mentioned the Mises Institute before, and one that is really focusing on the economy as a process that is constantly evolving and unfolding through entrepreneurship. And we already said that how entrepreneurship is creating everybody's future. Well, that's core to the economy. Then you can't really use graphs and things like that. You can't really use static tools either. So it requires a different type of understanding, right? And then some of these books are also very expensive and they're a tad too long. So, I mean, the standard reference is Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And it's a great book, but it is really just one lesson. And even though it has 30 some chapters, it is that one lesson over and over again. So you really learn that lesson, but you don't really understand it and you don't get sort of the economic intuition. And that's what I wanted to produce. And that's what I think people need more than anything, not to know a certain model or a certain concept or something like that instead, but to get this economic intuition, so you know, to get a feeling for a gut feeling for what the heck is going on, right? And how to interpret things around you. And there was really nothing very good in that space. So I discussed with Jeff Deist, who was then the president of the Mises Institute, and he thought it was a great idea and supported it. So I started writing it with the intent of what I had in mind was writing a book on the economy, not necessarily on economics, but on the economy that someone's grandma could read and understand. Something that is short and to the point and short enough that you can read it in an afternoon. And of course, avoiding all the math and jargon and all of this stuff. So if you would want to give your grandma a book on the economy, which I realize a lot of people might not want to, but if you would, then this should be your go-to, right? So this should be something that anyone can read. And well, it was hard. I think isn't it Mark Twain that says something that I'm sorry for the long letter, but I didn't have time to write a shorter one, something like that. And this was exactly that. I mean, it's super short. It's about half as long as Hazlitt's classic. So it's I think it's 30,000 words, something like that. People have read it in a couple of hours, but of course it took a long time to write the thing because I had to rewrite everything over and over again and decide on what to include and what to exclude and how to explain things in a way that makes sense to people, even if they have no education whatsoever, no schooling in economics.
Which, by the way, is a very difficult thing to do for those in the audience, right? I mean, there's in the app world, there's a saying that you are not your user, right? And you can apply that way of thinking, I'd argue, to any creative endeavor, right? You may want to write a book a certain way from your vantage point, but you have to consider the readers and obviously also factor in sort of the lowest common denominator to make sure that you don't lose the readers. I think that's a tremendous challenge.
Yeah, exactly, because you have the curse of knowledge, right? And in my case, with a PhD in the subject matter, there are plenty of things that I just take for granted because I don't think about them because they're so obvious to me, or I learned them a long time ago. So, but for others, it might be like, that's crazy, right? So I have to explain those things, and it's really hard to recognize and try to identify those things and avoid making those assumptions. And it helps me to think about what would my grandma, if she was still alive, be able to understand of this book? Well, assuming she could read English, which she couldn't. But could she understand this thing? Or do I need to sort of not dumb it down necessarily, but make it in simpler terms? And of course, cut off all the extra words. Just get to the point. Words don't really serve a purpose. And a short, good piece is better than a long, good piece, right? So content is king, I guess.
Everybody, please make sure you follow Per Bylund on Twitter. And I shared in the nest the book, How to Think About the Economy, a primer available at the Mises Institute website as well as on Amazon. Again, if anybody wants to come up and ask questions, feel free to click that bottom left mic request button. Presumably part of thinking about how the economy works is thinking about competition. I've made this point before. I think we're increasingly in a world where every industry is effectively an oligopoly. there's one or two, or three players that dominate the bulk of sales. There's a lot of conglomerates out there that you don't even realize they're conglomerates. How has the economy maybe changed over time as there's been more concentration of companies in and market share in general?
Well, I mean that's a big question. I think the issue here is not really that there is concentration in some industry. I mean, most industries that are what we call mature, which means they're about to die, they typically have one or a couple big, really influential companies, and they're going to die with their industry. Just like the producers of carriages died out after Henry Ford introduced the Model T, and just like flip phone producers died out after the first iPhone and things like that, right? Many of these mature industries have the sort of final remaining big business that has sort of captured the whole market because they outdid the others in competition. And that's not really a problem because they're going to be replaced pretty soon anyway. I think that the issue with competition is not really how many businesses there are. It's really about potential competition. And what I mean by that is that if you have no barriers to entry, so you haven't imposed any restrictions on who can run a business in this space. You don't have any protective legislation for the businesses in this space. You don't have any licensing requirements, whatever it might be that sort of adds cost to enter a certain industry. If you don't have that, then having one business producing all of whatever gadgets are produced in this industry is not really a problem, because they will have to keep prices low enough so that no one else wants to enter. And they have to continue innovating so that customers want to buy their products rather than something else. And of course, as consumers, we don't choose between two almost identical products only. We have limited cash, so we're going to choose between whatever is available to us. Right? So we're not only choosing between different kinds of meat, we're choosing between, well, maybe not eating it today at all and instead buying a lawnmower or whatever else. So competition exists as long as there are different products. The problem appears when there are artificial barriers to entry, which really means that government has regulated this industry so that the insiders, the incumbent firms, they can sort of rest on their laurels, and they realize that they're protected. So they don't have to bother with thinking about what a competitor might do or what type of new innovation might happen that we have to respond to quickly. How can we make sure that we invest enough in discovering new technologies and how to develop the products and things like that? Because if you're protected, you don't have to, right? And that is sort of the problem with monopoly or oligopoly, that they're not doing anything new. And we see this in a lot of industries, I think, because they're so regulated that it's really hard to enter these industries. Of course, one of those is the one where I work, higher education, where how do you start a new university? How do you start a new higher ed institution to compete with the universities? Well, of course, there are reputation effects that it's hard to provide courses online or whatever when there is a Harvard, because people are going to prefer Harvard rather than my unknown school, which is fine, because that just means that you have to really think about how you provide value. Well, the problem is also that you're not really allowed. You need a license in order to provide this sort of service. And then there are accreditation organizations that are keeping people out. I mean, that's the purpose of it. And there's plenty of government funding to these universities that have these credentials. So Oklahoma State, for instance, is one of the so-called R1s, which is the premier research-oriented universities in the U.S., which means we get, because we apply for it, but we get a lot of research funding and a lot of extra money from both the state and the federal government so that we can do research, basic research, and we can focus on that just as much or even more than teaching. Well, obviously that subsidizes the teaching part and keeps us alive whether or not students really like the education. So competing with us providing education is going to be really difficult because we're subsidized through all of these protections and all this extra funding. And we saw this with, it's not only education, of course, we see this in healthcare, for instance, and taxi is a good example too, that no one could really compete with taxi cab companies. So they were highly regulated. And for those of you who recall, getting a cab was not all that fun because you couldn't really rely on them showing up. It could take quite a while. They couldn't tell you when they might show up. The car could suck and be pretty nasty. The driver was rarely very accommodating and friendly and service oriented. And there were plenty of things wrong with it. And of course, you had to call a call center. You couldn't contact the driver directly, so you had no clue. All of this stuff, right? But they were regulated, so you couldn't compete with them. No one else could start a taxi company to compete with them. So what Uber did, which disrupted this industry completely, was start a cab service that was not a cab service. So by not only providing something that was a little bit different, but also making sure to position it both rhetorically and in terms of the service itself, position it as a not a cab company, which meant it was outside of these regulations. So the only way that the taxi companies could find competition, and they were providing the same service themselves, and they were operating their businesses in the same way, and they charged the same prices and all this stuff. It's basically oligopolies all over the country and perhaps the world. The only way competition could at all enter the picture was by completely rethinking the service and competing from outside that industry, right? Providing a completely different thing, calling it ride share instead of providing personal transportation as a taxi, which is really just the same thing. It's just done in a different way. But they had to step outside of that regulated space in order to compete with them. And that's why taking a taxi sucked, because they didn't actually fight for the customer's dollars. They could rest on their laurels, and they had already for decades. They were doing the same thing as they always had done. I mean, in New York City, the drivers bought a taxi medallion, which was basically a monopolist sort of approval, and they only had a certain number that were allowed. So these medallions, they basically guaranteed income. So the medallions were worth a lot, of course, in the market. Why? Well, because the government restricted who could drive a taxi cab. In New York City and elsewhere, I think it was mainly a way of keeping immigrants away from that industry, right? To provide those services, because it's easy for an immigrant to drive a taxi rather than find another kind of job. So it was an anti-immigration sort of regulation originally, I think. But in any case, competition matters, but only potential competition. So as long as businesses, no matter how many they are, they expect or can at least think that there is a potential for someone changing things up and undercutting them in some sense, either in terms of lower cost, lower price of the products because they've figured out a way to produce it more cheaply, or make a better version of the product. As long as that potential exists, they have to continue innovating or they will risk dying. So I think we need to think about competition in the right way and how it affects how the economy works. And that's where potential competition is much more important than the number of firms in an industry.
Let's get some of the audience up for some questions.
Okay, thanks. That's a good question. I think, my focus on grandma was not actual age. It was more in terms of someone who probably has very little formal knowledge in this field, who might have experience of just living, but might not have, but has not gained this intuition for how the economy actually works. So I think I actually thought of when writing it, or at least when completing it, that homeschooling should be a great market for this book too, because it lays out how it actually works. I mean, that's the title of it. how to understand the economy. And I think it would work really well to introduce kids to how the economy actually works and use it as a framework for discussing what's on the news, perhaps, or what does it mean to go to work? How can you make a career? Whatever other issues that might come up as part of that type of education. I think this would be a good introduction to it all. Think about all these things that the economy is about. And the book is in 3 parts. So the first one is really on how to study the economy and how to think about the economy. And the second one is the market and how the market actually works. And the third one is intervention. So it's about monetary intervention and also regulations. And I think if you're, it makes sense to read the whole thing for most of us, but if you are using it to discuss these issues with your kids as perhaps part of their education or as part of supplementing their schooling, then skipping the first part might be a good idea, because it's really how to go about thinking about it. So you can end with that part perhaps. But other than that, I would say it should be really well positioned for using it with kids too. I think the investment application of these ideas, there's still space for more books for sure. There are a bunch of them. I mean, one that comes to mind is The Tao of Capital, which might be helpful. But I can't say that I can think of one that is sort of the go-to reference. As far as the business cycle, I think that's a much bigger question than it sounded like, I think, because there are different theories of where the business cycle comes from. And one of the chapters in my book is about the sort of the logic of where it comes from. But there are other theories as well. And my take on it from an Austrian perspective is not the mainstream. So the mainstream would try to measure exactly when we enter a recession based on all kinds of statistics, and then when we exit and things like that. And I don't think it is really a matter of using statistics to measure and start points and end points and things like that. But I can definitely see that there is, since a lot of people are using these tools to determine whether we are in a recession, which people immediately think, oh my God, we're in a recession. But yesterday we were not, and then everything was fine. Then there is an incentive for a lot of players in the economy to make sure that the stats don't show a recession right now. And of course, in politics too, if an election is coming up, there's not going to be a recession. If an election just passed, then we might have been in a recession already. So you can play the statistics game. I don't think it matters all that much. What matters is really the overall process and the mechanisms in the marketplace. And those processes are what they are, regardless of what the statistics say.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Everybody, again, please make sure you follow Per Bylund. Per, really a real pleasure listening to you speak. I think there's a lot of truth to what you were saying as far as entrepreneurship goes and how to think about the economy in general. So thank you for that. Everybody, again, check out Per's book as well.